It is July 28th, and it's a Wednesday, 11 a.m. here on the west coast of the United States. My name is Arthur Asadurian. This is Apologia Center, and we have a great show today lined up for today. And hey, it's the internet. This stuff gets saved. Maybe you're watching this 50 years later. I have no idea, but we'll see what that's like. Let me introduce my guest right now. Um, and Mike Austin is Dr. Michael Austin, um, however you want to refer to him. Um, Let me give a brief description of his credentials, and then we'll jump into some stuff he's worked on. And some of it's very interesting when you look at the sort of stuff philosophers work on. So I'm excited for this. Um, Dr. Austin has a BA in political science from Kansas State University, MA in philosophy from Biola University, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Have you done any work, post grad kind of stuff after that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, thankfully. The PhD almost killed me, so I'm glad I'm done.
Okay, now you did your PhD on something, your dissertation was on parental rights and obligations. And this kind of
Yeah, that's right.
falls, I guess this falls into the realm of ethics, which is where you spend a lot of time in. And I think it's related to our subject. So, tell me about the dissertation, because that's interesting.
Yeah, it was. I wanted to do something in bioethics, and then my advisor, or who I wanted to be my advisor, David Boonen, suggested some topics outside of that, and this is one of them. So I did a little reading, got interested in it, and it really is. It's mostly not about policy or politics. It's primarily about moral arguments. What grounds parental rights, what grounds parental obligations, um, what are some of the implications of those things for educational choice, religious upbringing, things like that. So kind of a broad swath, but it was grounded in the dissertation is, of course, it's a dissertation for University of Colorado, so it's not explicitly Christian, but there's sort of a really it's grounded in the Trinity, I would argue. This idea that the rights are grounded in the nature of the relationships themselves, with intimacy and love. And so I did like a shorter version of that book later, like a little more accessible, called Wise Stewards, because basically it's a stewardship conception of parenthood, and that's grounded in the fact that parents don't own their children, but they are entrusted to care for them, which requires wisdom. And I was just talking to a friend recently about this, that I wrote my parenthood dissertation and then my parenthood book for a Christian publisher 12 or 13 years ago, and I read someone once say so many Christian books on parenting or books about parenting are written by parents with young children. um, and then you realize later, oh yeah, I guess there's a lot of stuff I didn't know, or
Um,
and that's okay. But that's good. I still stand by most of that stuff. I think it's good because the focus was more on cultivating kids, who helping them grow in
and
character, in Christ, those kind of things.
you have three daughters, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, and how old are they now?
Yeah. Now let's see, the oldest is 25, 23, and 21. So two out of college. Actually, one was out of college, now she's going back for a different degree, and then the other's about to be a senior. And
And
the
so
oldest is out.
when you wrote that was a bit different, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. They're in their early teens and younger.
You should
So
totally update that book. Like
yeah, it's a
as
good idea.
as someone who has three little kids, I mean 7, 5, and 3, I find myself in conversations about parenting quite a bit. I mean that's because of the ministry I do, and I'm surrounded. All of my friends essentially have kids around the same age. And when me and my friends get together, there's like 25 kids that are like, under 8 or something. It's just like insanity, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, part of that is just like trying to figure it out. Like, okay, obviously we have our upbringing with our parents and the way they did it, the right stuff, the wrong stuff, all of that. You come to an age and you realize stuff. And then, especially for those of us who come from non-Christian homes, there's an kind of an added, hey, wait, I want to honor God in the way I want to be a parent. And some of this stuff that you're saying is like, I don't own my children. God's given me the, responsibility to care for my children. And I guess I'll navigate with that to our our subject because I think that takes a great deal of humility to recognize that. Like
Mm.
you're not God. You're not God of your life. You're not the God of your children. You know, they're not your property or something like that. And we're using God maybe a bit loosely here. But how would you define humility?
Yeah, that's good. So I like a sort of an intuitive definition I work with is that it's a self-lowering, other-centeredness, and then you can catch that out in more detail. But I would say, like, as a Christian, I think Christ is the paradigm case of humility, and kind of what forms the basis of my conception is the Philippians 2:1-11 passage, which is the passage that most people when they write about it talk about the kenosis and what does it mean for Christ to empty himself or become human, and those are thorny theological questions. But when you actually read the passage in its context, in the context of the overall book, the argument of Philippians, it's about ethics, it's about character, it's about imitating Christ.
Hmm.
So humility for Christians is it's a social virtue. So a lot of secular philosophers and even some Christian ones think of humility primarily as a self-regarding trait, where it's recognizing my limits, my weaknesses, my sin. Some would say it is that. But when you read through the way humility is discussed in the New Testament, the prominent way of understanding it is a virtue that is shown in relationship to God and to other people. Humble before God, humble before them, and before other people. It means it's a disposition to put their interests ahead of our own, right?
Hmm.
To
Okay.
value their interests more than our own.
So I want your comments on this. I heard Dallas Willard define humility as thinking of yourself rightly, which is kind of where I've kind of tried to establish humility because sometimes like we think about stuff like I give this example of like athletes. Let's just say you're like the greatest athlete on the planet on a subject, and somebody says, "Hey, you're the best at this." All the stats, everything shows you're the best at it. And you go, "Oh no, I'm not."
Yeah,
And I like everybody can recognize that as wait, hang on, you are the best. And there isn't, at least in my opinion, there isn't anything wrong with saying, yeah, I am currently the best in that subject. I don't know whether that. I'm not very sure if that's a non-humble kind of position, and maybe what would make it not humble is saying, yeah, and nobody's ever gonna beat me. I'm the greatest ever. Kind of taking it a step above that, but to
yeah.
recognize where you're at in kind of the skill set that you have. It's like this fine balance. I don't know. I mean, you can comment on that and
No, I think that's really good. I actually deal with that exact kind of case in a journal of applied philosophy. It's humility of virtue in sports or something like that. And so I imagine your situation with Usain Bolt, right? So if he's maybe not now, but during his prime, for him to deny that he's the best 100-meter sprinter in the world, that would be false humility, right? It's just not true. Um, so I would argue what humility looks like in that situation, it's like you said, it's thinking of yourself rightly. And so I can be humble and think, yeah, I'm the best in the world. I mean, the numbers and the empirical data support that. But that's done in the context of that doesn't make me any more valuable than other human beings or superior to them or my needs or interests more important. And it recognizes that that's much of that's not up to me. Now, sure, I put the work in. Don't want to ignore that fact. But think about all the things that have to happen for an elite athlete to be the best at
hmm,
their sport in the world. Help with family and friends, genetic gifts, environmental, when and where they were born. I'm sure probably the fastest human ever lived. Nobody knows who they were. Probably a safe bet. But in terms of these days, better chance. And so that's kind of where I would come from on that.
yeah, it's very interesting. I was speaking to my oldest brother who was a pretty decent soccer player in his day, and he he was talking about how when he was like 7 or 8, he went and signed himself up in the soccer team, and um, would walk there, would walk to training alone as like an 8-year-old, and it was quite a bit of distance and stuff like that. And then I told him, oh, I remember reading an article on Muhammad Salah, and like he had to walk from his village to Cairo, where the training was, and then the article was saying if he didn't do this task, maybe he wouldn't have become the player that he is. Like essentially, he was training when he was walking, but he had to
Mm-hmm.
because it was out of necessity. Like, and you think about all the people in the world that do things because of necessity, and maybe they don't have the opportunities to make it. Now, I talk about sports because I know you've done some writing in that area. Why don't you tell us about some of the writing in that specifically? Because I think it's utterly unique for a philosopher to write in those
Mm.
areas. Because I know you love sports, and you coach, and then some recent works that you've finished and are working on, and then we'll put the links to that stuff in the description box.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't even really know philosophers worked in sports until back in 2006. I wanted to do one of those popular philosophy books. So like, the first ones were like The Simpsons and Philosophy, The
Uh,
Matrix, and I wanted to do one on running because that was really well. I played American football and association football. Sorry, I just have to put it that way. I can't help myself. Soccer growing up. Um, Really track and cross country, kind of middle distance and distance running I was into, and I kept that up just on my own for fun in college and since then. So I wanted to do a book on running and philosophy because there's already an affinity there. Like people, especially that do sort of longer distance running, it's a contemplative kind of thing, or at least a lot of people that do it are more introspective and more thoughtful. Not everybody,
mm,
but it just draws that kind of personality. So I thought, well, this is a great thing. And I was like, well, who am I going to get to write chapters on this? I knew I had friends that ran and that were, but then I came across the International Association for the Philosophy of Sport, right? So it's this international group. There's all this literature on the like Olympism and sports, and people go back and look what Plato said. So anyway, a lot of what I've done, so the running and philosophy book, I did one on football, one on the Olympics, these kind of edited volumes. And then I wrote one on humility as a virtue in the context of sport. And so I really want, they can be redeemed, right? So, we've even seen the past few days the stuff with Simone Biles and people like jumping all over her and forgetting sports should be, they're about human excellence. And we've got
mm,
to remember that human part, right? So think about, well, I know you're a Liverpool supporter, so the young keeper,
yeah.
when they were in the final, that could, we're human, right? We make the best in the world make mistakes. I tell the girls on my high school team, they shoot and miss a shot and they're all upset, and I say, look, the best players in the world miss more than they make. The key is keep taking them, right? Failure's just a given for the best, so it is for you as well. And now I'm kind of going on a ramble. I'm not even sure where I'm headed with this, except for I think especially as a Christian philosopher, a lot of Christians are really skeptical about the value of sports.
Mm,
They see the win or die kind of attitude, or that winning is all that matters. The presence of ego and all the things that we know are negative about it. But not only the ancient philosophers, but there's good sort of Christian thought that sports can be redeemed, right? So as a coach, it's a public school, so I'm not, preaching the gospel to my team. I'm trying to live it out in front of them by, for example, a time where I lost it on the sidelines, and I apologize to them, apologize to the ref that I did that to. Um, if I just admit my limits to them and say, I don't know everything. So if you see something we need to work on, tell me. Don't be afraid.
mm,
But I think sports provide, as some scholars have put it, it's like a character laboratory, right? Because they're not real life in a certain sense, especially thinking of youth sports here. Although you can all the way through the elite levels, a chance to cultivate and develop virtues that then can be transferred to other contexts. So if I can develop humility, um, you think about the playmaker in soccer who would rather provide an assist than a goal. A goal, I mean, they still get some glory, but nothing like the, you know, 30 goal a year
yeah.
guy that puts in the back of the net. But that's humility. Now, if I can recognize that's humility there and apply that same mindset to my relationship with my family or my friends or whatever, there's value there. And then the only other thing I can think of, this, every once in a while somebody actually reads your paper in an academic journal and like to get something out of it, not just to argue with it. Um, I wrote a thing several years ago called Sports as Exercises in Spiritual Formation or something like that for the Journal of Spiritual Formation and Soul Care. It's like using sports. I mean, they're valuable for their own sake, but I think they also are value in, they can be they can be a context where we cultivate our walk with God and grow in Christian virtue. So
Yeah. So I've commented in a church context, and I've usually gotten weird stares from people when I've said things like, "Well, when I play soccer, it's a time of like rest and solitude for me." And because I can, like, if I'm just boggled and just have a lot of stuff going on, I prefer to play soccer because I can block everything out for that whatever 40 minutes, an hour and a half, whatever it might be. It's just like the game, and so it becomes a restful kind of experience where I'm just like, okay, I'm kind of not focusing on anything else, and kind of people look at it, wait, but you're physically getting tired, right? Like you're running, you're not sitting. It's not a restful kind of activity. But that's just
yeah,
experientially. I realized that pretty early on in my Christian walk. Like here's an activity that I do where nothing else really matters. Um, and then I found out about spiritual disciplines. Like, hey, this seems to be that in that context. You got a book on your shelf back there. It says God and Guns in America, and it's kind of
yeah,
I love. I don't know whether you did the cover for that, but it's like stares you in the face.
yeah. It's pretty good.
It's nice.
Um,
It's a nice title.
yeah, I've been trained on these video interviews, right? You just put one of your books up there.
Absolutely. And so, tell us about that because that seems to be amongst conservatives. Conservative. When I say, well, that means a bunch of stuff, but let's just
Yeah.
generally say conservative American evangelicals, whatever like that. It might be a bit controversial as to what you're arguing for in that book.
Yeah, so I sort of fell into that. I didn't really set out to intentionally write the book. Several years ago, I think I had read some stuff, and both secular and some Christian stuff, and I thought these are really bad arguments or really poor uses of Scripture. And I've seen it on both sides, but at that time it was primarily the more conservative bent,
Mm.
because of course that's what more of that shows up, I think, from Christians in America. Um, so I wrote an online thing or two about it, just responding, and then I did a kind of a debate, I guess, in Christian Research Journal, that magazine, several years ago. And then I got contacted. This has never happened to me. I don't know if it ever will again, but by a publisher who they were looking for somebody to write this kind of book, and because at that time there really was nothing, like no book length treatment,
Hmm.
or at least not many. I came across a couple, but they were kind of they were differently oriented. So I just wanted to try to as a way to learn. A lot of times when I write something, it's to figure out what I think. That was part of this, and then also the book's intended to really challenge people at both ends of the spectrum. So I really challenge the conservatives. You talk about Christian who is this, like, really sort of falls in line with sort of strong Second Amendment, almost seeing Second Amendment as an absolute right and near absolute. Wants to um, like really strong self-defense, and I would say actually sometimes it errs into to not realizing that self-defense, even if it's justified Christianly, which I think it can be, uh, that it's a tragedy, right? Because
Hmm.
it ends up hurting or killing someone made in God's image. Since the worst of us are that. On the other side, I argue in the book that there are moral justifications for the right to bear arms, right? So people that are more on the extreme pacifist side probably don't really appreciate that much. So I try to thread the needle a little bit, um, and I come up with this I construct a view, or I guess really describe a view called being a peacemaker. And in one sense, it's just war theory recast, but
Hmm.
I wanted to put it that way because I think even just the name just war theory orients your thoughts to, okay, how can we defend violence or defend going to war?
Hmm.
Where peacemaker is, yeah, there are times where violence might be necessary, but truly taking it as a last resort, which just war theory says it does, but in practice we don't see that. People still use it, and they don't really take that last resort criterion seriously. Peacemaker in Christ says, look, if there is a nonviolent solution, I'm going to go to the mat for that. Um, so, yeah, I mean, I've kind of taken criticisms from both sides, and I'm usually a centrist about many things, so I'm kind of used to that. But I want to speak. I know I do it wrongly, and I don't know everything. I mean, if I knew what I was wrong about, I hope I'd change my mind. But I'm trying to speak prophetically, kind of to both wings of the church,
Yeah.
and see where's some common ground we can have, and where can we just realize that there are um, plausible Christian arguments on both sides of it, right? Sort of on these questions of war and peace and guns and things like that. So I tend more towards the pacifist and the restriction side, but also recognizing that there is I would argue, a right to self-defense and even a moral right to bear arms in certain contexts.
Okay, so this kind of brings us into disagreement, right? Because we're talking about
Yeah.
humility and disagreement. And it's very interesting because usually most of us find ourselves disagreeing with one group of people. You kind of, with this book specifically, put yourself in a place where you're disagreeing with, these wings, like you said. Um, how can we do it well? Because a lot of times I see just people in general, maybe it's American society. I don't think it is because I kind of live in between cultures, I would say. Um, how can we disagree well as Christians? Uh, and I would say this in two ways. How can we disagree well with as Christians with others who aren't Christians? And then how can we disagree well with other Christians? Because I think there is a change in their like family dynamics. Like, hey, so let's talk about that, and then we'll go with the next subject.
Yeah, let's start with like Christians to Christians, because I think, man, that's just hard, because it seems like, I don't know if it's really gotten worse, but it sure feels like it's gotten worse in the past 5, 6 years. Some of that has to do with Trump, some with the pandemic, but even before that, I think it's probably because it's more public on social media. Like, people would get in really heated disagreements, well, of course, throughout history, right, about theology, and to the point of killing each other over
Yeah.
our theology. But if we think about just the contemporary scene, I mean, look, Christians have to just realize that the starting point is that we are brothers and sisters in Christ, right? That everything should start there. So we're family members. I mean, if you take Jesus at his word, those family bonds among believers are stronger than biological ones, right? In the sense of, if I have to give up one or the other, I'm supposed to give up those kinship relations, not my faith and my brothers and sisters in Christ. Tragedy, but still, I think you can make a case for that. So regardless of, especially in that culture, when the family relationships were so much stronger and tighter, so I think they would have hurt him much more radically than we do today, at least in 21st century America. So that's the starting point, right? And if you look at those, so much of the New Testament of Paul and others, when they talk about what's going on, it's protecting the purity and the truth, right? So the office of teacher is really important. But then it's protecting the unity of the body of Christ, and that we need each other. We rely on each other, that they'll know each other. They'll know we're his disciples by our love. And so as we go at each other, in one sense, that's okay if we're debating something, right? If we're going at the issues, the ideas, but it's so hard not to turn that into going at the person and at their character, or are they really a Christian, all those kind of things. So we start with that. We realize we're made in God's image, both of us, right? And we belong to him. And then I guess I'll say one more thing, and it actually comes from Dallas Willard too, which I have appropriated in the classes I teach in ethics here. Just this picture, Willard says we should see ourselves, I believe it's from The Allure of Gentleness, one of my favorite apologetics books, that we shouldn't see ourselves as like in opposition face to face, right? Arguing and debating. We should see ourselves standing side by side, trying to discuss and help each other discover the truth. And I think if we just do, that's radical for me, a radical change. And while I think so that's what I think, if we approached it that way, and look, and with some humility, realizing that, this person, I could learn from this person. They might be right and I might be wrong. Even if that's not the case, I could still learn and grow from them. And it's a chance to grow in character, right? In patience and love, if you ultimately disagree, but you can still, love the person and agree to disagree and move on in Christ together.
Yeah, a while ago, I don't remember what context this was in, but it might have been an ethics class. It might have been like a normative ethics class. We were looking at Nazi propaganda, and one of the ways that they got their way was drawing these pictures and stuff like that and putting it out there where they were dehumanizing the other, right, the Jew in this case. they were, oh, they're like rats and stuff like that, and they would do these caricature paintings and pictures and stuff like that. And we've seen that repeated. I think it's the same issue with abortion, referring to children in the womb as like clump of cells or something like that. There's a dehumanizing that's taking place actually there. And with Christians, one of the things I've realized that happens subtly is that whenever someone disagrees with you, somehow they're not a Christian. Like this secondary issue, whatever it is that you're disagreeing with, say it's a theological point, now becomes so central where they're no longer Christians. So now you're somehow justified to approach them and, call them to repentance or something like that. When the individual's like, no, I'm a Christian. I just don't agree with what you're saying. Here's my justification biblically. Um, and that's extremely dangerous because essentially what we're saying is that they're not a child of God. And if God thinks they're a child and we don't think they're a child, I see that as being a big problem.
Yeah.
So in the midst of disagreement, I mean, how do we bring in some of these virtues, right? Like, how do you train yourself practically to disagree well with people who might actually be going out of their way to offend you,
Right.
especially
Yeah,
those?
yeah, right. It's difficult. So like in person, it's generally been I generally haven't had a problem doing that with people face to face. But
Hmm.
I mean, look, people that know me at all, stuff I've written, know that I was pretty strongly opposed to Trump as a president on certain reasons. So I felt called to make arguments about that. Um, with the guns thing, these days with critical race theory, some stuff that I pushed back on some of the stuff with. I think that it was easy for me in those screen to screen interactions just to like react. That first reaction wasn't always the Christian one. So
Hmm.
I've apologized to people in public and in private. Um, that's important, right? If I blow it, because when you apologize, sooner or later, if you're still apologizing for the same thing, it's a sign that maybe you haven't really repented, and so you got to do some, let the Spirit do some soul work.
Hmm.
But I think that um, I lost it, Arthur. Tell me that
Okay,
what's
okay, when people are kind of getting on your nerves, right? Like it's
yeah.
these,
Oh, the virtues.
yeah, like what
Yeah.
practical things you can do to develop virtues like that to not repeat the same stuff, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So I think it's the first is the humility, and where does that come from? I mean, it's got to be through prayer and asking God create that in you, help you cultivate it. And so I can do some intentional things to cultivate humility, like do acts of service that go unrecognized, or um, practice not saying anything about my accomplishments, right?
Hmm.
Or as Dallas Willard once said, practice the discipline of not having to have the last word. That's been a good one for me in real life and online. Because I think as believers, especially those of us who, well, look, we have a passion for Christ and the truth, and so there's this compulsion in us sometimes to like not let something go that we think is false or dangerous. And I'm not saying we should just let everything go, but what I am saying is we don't always need the last word. And you look at how Christ related to people, it was
Hmm.
nuanced, it was wise, and yeah, if we could, I mean, he would be hardcore with some people, other people gentle, but he always, we're not gonna, we can't like, we're not omniscient, or well, we're not the incarnate Son of God, so we're a little handicapped compared to him. But still, that way of thinking um, patiently, of humility, of compassion. And so for me, it's helped to see both in myself, because I recognize that a lot of times when I act in ways that are wrong or vicious or
Hmm.
prideful. It, Sometimes it's just sin nature. Sometimes it's the sinful response to kind of your environment, how you grew up, whatever it is. But realizing other people are messed up too, and rather than just seeing them as jerks, seeing them as people who are fallen, just like we are. So kind of level the playing field in that way, where they're just messed up in different ways than we are, and trying to give the grace that we would want. I think those are
Yeah.
practical helps. But that discipline of not having the last word, not having to have it, that can be useful, especially for people who study philosophy and theology, because we're always you know, our trade is arguments in a certain sense, right? And so
Yeah.
it's being willing just to let things go and trust that that's okay to do. God had that, God's bigger than you. Um,
Yeah. Maybe all philosophers should have a requirement to get married or something. Um,
yeah, that would be sad for their spouses.
well,
Yeah.
they'd very quickly realize that not arguments are arguments worth fighting and winning.
Well, that's true.
I know that's true in my life. Um,
Yeah.
so bringing this into intellectual honesty, because there's things that we believe, there's things that we think are true. Say like you were speaking about the gun conversation, and there's Bible passages that regularly are used, for example.
Yeah.
And then saying, okay, I'm going to give this a serious shot. You sit down, you look back at the passages, you go, oh man, even though I want this passage to support my viewpoint, it doesn't seem like that's the case. And I think a lot of us on various subjects have seen this, sometimes theological ones. You sit down, you really dig through the passage, and you go, yeah, it's not really in support of my statement. Like either the author's trying to say something completely different, or maybe it's actually saying what the opposing side is trying to say
Yeah.
here. How do we develop the ability to have that sort of an intellectual honesty where that's the norm in our lives?
Mm. I think when you feel that, like I felt this with the gun debate, where some, because I used some empirical stuff in that book. Some of it I'm pretty confident in. Some of it now I would probably back off. There's like one example is how many defensive gun uses there are per year. So
Hmm.
you can find numbers anywhere from roughly 50,000 to others claiming 3.5 million. Well, that's a pretty big difference. Um, and so I tried to somewhere in the lower end, but in the middle or in between those two. But then I just contacted this guy at Johns Hopkins who has done this kind of research for 20 years, and he said he's come to the conclusion that we don't really know and we can't really know the number. And he gave some reasons why, and it made sense, right? So it's being willing to admit that kind of stuff. But when you feel that, I mean, that feeling you get where, like when you're talking about, I've got a theological position, I think a pastor supports it, and then I read it, I have the experience of like this. I don't know if it's a frustration or anxiety or just that tension, both cognitive and emotional. Well, that's a time to just say, okay, I'm feeling this way. Why? You know, Probably because there's some pressure being put on maybe some of my beliefs, and what do I do about that? Right? I
Yeah.
try to just pray to come at it honestly. I think that's part of it. I think the other thing we can do is to do these kind of things in community, right? So we study with others, or we work through these things in conversation with others. So I have good friends that if there's some kind of issue I'm dealing with or struggling with, whether some passage of scripture, doctrine, or philosophical view, I could talk through it, and they're not going to be afraid to say I'm wrong, right? Or
Hmm.
or at least challenge me or say, well, here's what I think and why. So as someone who teaches, most 20-year-olds or 19-year-olds they don't really jump at the chance to disagree with a professor, which is unfortunate, but it's the nature of it. Um, so you need people who are willing to do that, right? Um,
So has that changed, by the way, in your career, where maybe previously you had your students more willing to disagree with you than kind of nowadays?
yeah, it seems like they're a little less willing these days, um, and I've always encouraged it. I've told them, I tell them at the start, disagreeing is not going to affect your grade. I don't care what, and I tell them in a certain sense, I don't care what you think,
Yeah.
and for the purposes of the class. Now I care what you think because I want you to believe what's true, care about what's good and what's beautiful. But that's the other thing from Willard. It's like trusting people to come to that with your help, but also on in their time or in God's time. So I think students today, I mean, what's a little different in Eastern Kentucky University, just culturally, there's still like a Christian subculture through a
Hmm.
lot of this part of the country. Not, I wouldn't say like, I mean, there's good and bad about the Bible Belt for sure. One good thing is there's still sort of this some familiarity with with the basic Christian story and the scriptures, although that's waning as well. But so students are respectful here generally. But yeah, I think these days students are really afraid just to take a stand about something because they're afraid of what will happen to them, right? If
Well,
they, if,
hmm. Why
so
do you
whether,
think that is? I mean, other than like what would happen to them? Well,
yeah, I mean, maybe it's the concern about rejection by their peers, right? Whether, and this can be across the spectrum, right? So there's, most, I mean, yeah, the data shows most like university faculty tend Democratic or left, left or left of center in the U.S., minority or more conservative. So I think in that environment, for some, they don't care at all. They'll just say what they think. I think others are
mm,
scared to like, they feel they're like these boundaries that no one really says, but you can feel that they're there. So they might be afraid of that. Um, might be switched to some of our more conservative, like evangelical colleges and seminaries, where they feel that conservative pressure.
yeah,
But I think it's just, look, the thing I loved about Talbot, one of the many things where I got my master's was it might have been the first day of class. It's sort of classic J.P. Moreland. He was like, everything's up for grabbing here, like everything. So we didn't have to be afraid of saying what we thought, and so
yeah,
that's good. We need to have that environment um, wherever we're at. Doesn't mean that anything goes, but it means that anything can be put on the table for discussion and analysis and argument. And so I think the other reason is students are just they aren't confident in their intellectual abilities. There's an insecurity there, maybe. And this is sort of off the cuff, but I've had conversations and done some reading about it, and I think that's a big part. I think, and even from talking to students who I've interacted with, my students who don't really speak up in class, a lot of them are just afraid to talk, right? And that's okay. I didn't talk much, at least my first couple of years of college. I just
mm,
sat in the back and, you know, avoided or scoffed when I felt like it, or was
mm,
stoic. But I think there's a lack of confidence that in them in themselves intellectually, and so if we can help them both have a confidence grounded in truth and give them opportunities to cultivate some of the intellectual virtues, we can help them.
yeah. I wonder how much of this stuff is cultural because me and my surroundings, the Armenians, are very loud folks. And for example, like I never struggled with that, and that could be because I grew up in a home with three other boys. I'm pretty sure it is partly because I'm the third in the four boys kind of lineup, and so I had to survive in my house to a certain
Yeah.
extent. Um, some of this culture is like you're encouraged to do these things, So it was very weird for me to see classmates that had something to say and not say it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, why is that the case? Um, how can we cultivate, I guess, family in our families, children, even in our church communities, this intellectual honesty that comes with, hey, it's okay to struggle and deal and be honest with whatever you're doing without necessarily being like ostracized or judged or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think we do a lot. I mean, we still have a long way to go, but I guess I can say I think we've seen progress. Like there are more people in churches and around churches willing to, where someone might express some doubts, and there are at least my sense is there are more places where that's dealt with better than maybe it was 30 years ago, say when I was in college. But it's still a big problem, I think. And so just we're so worried about people believing the exact right things, but we forget that they're people
Hmm.
and that it's a process, right? And so I think again, it's having communities where those things are valued. So look, if I've got, I mean, these days the kind of language that gets used is deconstruction, right? And I hate that term for it because I think at its best it should be something more like renovation, right?
Hmm.
I mean, because I think what we're doing, well, some people it ends up, as we know, it ends in atheism or even a really sort of antagonistic atheism. But some people go through kind of that process and are trying to figure out, okay, what are the things I believe that are more a product of, say, American culture or Armenian culture or Hungarian culture, where I lived a long time ago for a year, and what are some things that actually are true of the way of Jesus, that are of Him, of the truth, and so that's valuable work, and so just being willing to do that and give people the space to work through that and encourage them without having to try to fix them. I mean, we probably all have the experience of being in a small group and you share a struggle, whether it's like a something going on at work or your family or even something you believe, and then there's the person who gives you the 5-minute sermon to sort of fix you. Um, and maybe it's my personality, but just usually it just doesn't work, right? I don't want to be talked at, I guess, and I think most of us don't. I think the spirit behind it is people are genuinely trying to help, so I'm not saying that, but I think there are better ways to go about it, and we're not good at that balance of challenging someone, but giving them grace and compassion for where they're at. And so I would love it if people could raise these questions. I mean, so here's an example. Several years ago, we were part of a younger church, and I'm actually a registered independent. I've been registered in all three parties over the 35 years of my voting, so I'm kind of politically all over the map. So I thought, well, independent's probably the best. It's the most representative. But in Kentucky several years ago, there's the gubernatorial election. Another guy at church was talking about the guy who had the incumbent, and he was a Republican. And I said, no, I actually voted for the Democrat. I mean, there's some differences. I thought this was a better decision in this particular case. But you would have thought like I had just, desecrated the sanctuary, somehow. And so, yeah, I mean, look, people have really deep convictions, both as Christians and even evangelical Christians on the left and on the right. And we tend to, look, I've had people I've had people assure me that even though I'm not as conservative as they think I should be, that they still think I'm a Christian. I'm just like, come on. Yeah, I mean, I get that in a sense, because the view is these things are they're like core convictions of mine that I take from Scripture. That's their perspective. But of course, people have that across the political spectrum with biblical convictions. And so there's no clean divide. And I know that people argue about that, and I'm not really, honestly, I don't even, I'm worn out by the politics stuff. But I think that's it. We've got to give people the space to do that. And so if my child, she wouldn't mind me sharing this, like when our oldest daughter was in middle school, it's that classic American Christian teenager angst. I'm not sure I'm really a Christian. I'm not sure what I believe. And we didn't jump all over her and give her 10 apologetics books. We just talked about it. We asked her what was going on, and we did go through some apologetic stuff and just some conversations. And often those kind of doubts can be, as you know, probably from experience and ministering to people, sometimes they're intellectual, sometimes they're purely emotional, sometimes they're both. Like in last couple of years, even, I'd say, talking with some friends of mine, I think I have some doubts, but I would cast them as emotional, or maybe, I don't know if existential or phenomenological, to use fancy words. I can't say I'm really struggling with the problem of evil, or why did God do this, or why didn't God do this. It's more just like a felt sense of God's absence or something like that. And there are several reasons for it. One of them is I think the Word wasn't really living and active in my life. That's one. Another is I think God does hide himself from us sometimes for the purpose of our growth. And so, yeah, if we could just not panic and entrust not just ourselves, but our people in our church and our children to God, and seek to love and serve them. I mean, I think the best advice I would give to parents now, as someone who's a little farther down the road, is if you're going to err on the side of love and grace and encouraging your kids wherever they're at. That doesn't mean anything goes, but just in a certain sense, we should just lighten up a little bit and put more of our energy into those things. So I don't know if that's helpful, but those are the things that jump to my mind.
No, it is. I'm thinking in the church context, because there's always this fear of like heresy coming in and false teaching coming in, and I've had situations in church context where I've had to pull people aside and say, hey, I heard you were teaching such and such a thing to someone, or and it wasn't in the sense of like, oh, I'm questioning this, but you were teaching it as though that's what the Bible teaches. And that's not a biblical position. I mean, I guess there's always that fear when people say, so in like Bible study, right? Somebody might say, I'm not sure about this Trinity.
Yeah.
And so, that you could have a reasonable discussion on that. It's like, okay, what if you're not sure? Let's look at the text. Let's do this. But there's a difference with that and somebody going around saying, oh, the Trinity's not in the Bible. This is not, Christians shouldn't believe in the Trinity. Right. Something like that, where I guess the approach changes in that kind of a sense. But we should still have some kind of a room, even for those people um, that are teaching that stuff, but in a balanced way, where they're obviously not going into very fundamental teachings of our churches and our communities.
Yeah, you want people in your community and anyone who, in a certain sense, someone who's, but it's difficult because those sort of things really matter. So if, like, I wouldn't want that person leading a small group, and if that person was in a small group, you would have to, I mean, probably a case by case basis, but you don't want, I mean, it just seems consistent with the New Testament that, look, there are certain things that are non negotiable. And to be a part of this, you need to believe X, Y, and Z, right? Someone denies the resurrection. Oh, sorry, you can't be, you can come to our church,
Yeah,
but you can't be a member because that's a core commitment of our community. Just to put the most, what I would argue is the least biblically controversial requirement for being a
yeah,
member of the
absolutely.
body of Christ. I mean, I know there's a ton of other stuff, Trinity and other historical doctrines, but so I'm taking the easiest low hanging fruit there. But
Oh,
but yeah, but I think it's difficult, and I think there's a lot more confusion. People have a lot broader spectrum of belief or questions than we realize. I've come to see that over the years because I've assumed people believe X, Y, and Z, and then I have a conversation with them and they don't, or they only believe X and Y, things that I think are kind of fairly clear from Scripture, from our tradition. So yeah, but we've got to be able to engage people like that, give them space to ask questions, and yeah, just try to come alongside them rather than. Now, there are times for confrontation. I'm not arguing against that, but I think often maybe we're too quick to that in some instances, and then in other instances not quick enough. So
oh, okay. Um, so I'm gonna share a story that I had, and I want you to comment on it because so I had like this. I don't want to say it's a crisis of faith, but it was probably the most intense one I've had, and that's when I was in seminary. I was working on a paper on whether God was free to create the universe the way it is, the like out of all possible worlds, if God would,
yeah,
And so I was reading William Rowe, and I was reading a book he wrote on the subject, and he gave this like completely valid argument in my mind, but his conclusion was therefore God doesn't exist, and I was kind of staring at this. I actually remember what I was doing. I was sitting down, on the ground reading, and everything started to flash between my eyes. I was like, okay, if this is true, I got to drop out of school. I got to stop my job, like my entire life changes based on this. And I remember thinking, wait, there are people that are way more intelligent than I am, and at the time I was thinking about my professors and I'm pretty sure they're familiar with this argument. They're just not convinced by it. That's the only thing that kept me kind of balanced in it and saying there must be something wrong in here. Now, I say that because there was all sorts of emotions and thoughts happening at that moment. Because you spoke about community. This is why this story popped up in my mind. You spoke about community, and that was my community. It was like, wait, I have all these people. How does that kind of come into the picture of cultivating humility and intellectual honesty and disagreement, doing all that well? Like God, when I say well, I mean honoring God as
yeah.
well. So,
No, I think that's vital. I mean, some similar, not exactly that experience, but just so a friend of mine who's a pastor several years ago was talking about that. Like just he couldn't pray, and so he would only prayers he could bring himself to do were sort of more liturgical, right? Prayers that had been written out by somebody else. So he did that because it just what was going on in his life, just the extemporaneous stuff just wasn't there. Struggling with his faith, and he talked about. I think I had shared it that this was a long time ago. Well, relatively long time. Some struggles with doubts I was having, and it was like that's when sometimes the faith of the community can help carry you along in those moments where yours is wavering. And so I think that's an important part of humility. It's like when you're 18 and you read Nietzsche, and then you think, well, this is it, right? This is everything. Obvious. Sorry, moved out of the camera. I've got a little family not emergency, but I'm going to send my daughter a text. Is that all right, Arthur?
Yeah, go for it.
If you can edit this or not, then it'll just
No,
be.
no, this is raw. Um,
That's good.
and this goes, I guess, with our comment and what we're talking about. Family comes before all these things.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a
So
responsibility.
I
So
was supposed to leave her a debit card to go get something. She's just moved back to our house and going to nursing school. She was a journalist in Louisville. And so sometimes they come back. All right. So that's done. Now I can focus back in. That's right. Family.
Americans need to realize most of the world lives in these like gigantic community complexes.
Yeah.
Right. Like they got like 3 generational. Like when I was in Armenia, that's one of the things. Like you go into a home and then there's, in Armenia it's really crazy because it'll be, the family, and then there'll be the parents, the children, and then at times there's like aunts and uncles as well.
Yeah.
And it's a gigantic family unit, and then decisions are made, and you're kind of like, I'm just really not used to this. But that's most of the world.
Yeah.
There's a good side to that as well.
Yeah, certainly. And so I think, that can be. Look, the humility. That's what you asked, and I think that's an excellent example. It's like, so I come across Nietzsche. Oh God, doesn't everybody know this? Of course, religion is all just evil. Right, and then, or think about the problem of evil, right? There are still philosophers trotting out the logical problem of evil, like it just proves there's no God, right? It's like they haven't read Plantinga, or carefully, or But I think there's something to that. So it's like you said, they are realizing, look, there are people that are a lot more intelligent than I am, that know a lot more than me, that still think Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. The Bible's reliable. Now, you can't just use that as, well, for some people that's enough, and that's okay, right? So not everybody is called to sort of dig into these things more deeply. And I have people that I know that are like, wonderful followers of Jesus, that's enough for them. They don't need to read it all. You and me, we're different. Like, part of the reason I went back to this stuff is I knew there were people that knew all that stuff, but I wanted to know that stuff. I wanted to dig in for myself, right? That was just, I think that was part of the call of God, personality structure, those kind of things. But it is humility to say, I'm not an expert. Even the experts disagree, but being, as a Christian, being willing to trust members of your community and realize that being able to hold those questions and not let them dominate your life, but taking, as William Lane Craig, I think he said this once in a interview I watched, we've all got more questions if we are into this stuff than we'll have time to really answer in a lifetime, like to go all the way down. So he said, take an issue that maybe the one that's bothering you the most, or one that you would really like to dig into that one. Right? Go in depth. Interact with, like in your case, your professors. Why do they not believe that argument? What can you read? Replies to Roe, those kind of things. That's helped me because, and I guess the other thing that helps is over time, as I look back, I'm 52, about questions I've had over the years, to varying degrees, they've all been answered, at least the ones that I've dug into, to my satisfaction, some more easily than others. But then that builds a sort of faith. It's like when the next question comes up, well, I don't know the answer, it's like it doesn't tend to like rock your world so much, right? It doesn't mean you ignore it necessarily, but there's less of that, like you described, sort of this flash going on, and like, I've got to change my whole life, I've been living a lie for 30 years, that kind of stuff. So I think that's really helpful, that humility. And look, we could use a lot of that today, not just in the church, but in our culture.
I agree. Yeah, I've been on the fence sort of with I forget her name. It's Simone, right? The Olympian that dropped out.
Oh, Simone Biles. Yeah.
And so, because my initial reaction was, when I saw it, you're an athlete, you've put yourself out there. This is going to be a stressful situation. Yeah, the world is watching it. Like, you should know this. And the other thing, the thing that also popped up is you took someone's spot. Like someone was training their entire life to be where you are, and then you just dropped out, and that person. So I was kind of thinking in that route as well. But as I've been reading and various folks, I'm just kind of like, hang on here. And like, we gotta be great, because I'm seeing people not being gracious at all. Like, even if she's wrong, I don't care. Even if she's wrong, she shouldn't have done it. Like, you gotta be gracious.
Yeah.
Like, she made a mistake. Like, forgive. And I'm seeing Christians not being very forgiving and not being very gracious. And it's just always ironic in a situation like that.
Well, And I've seen people, whether either just lie, and not Christians, either lie or just not pay attention to what happened. So I watched the replay last night. Didn't watch it live because it's the middle of the night, but you can hear her tell her teammates, "I've got to do this. I don't want to jeopardize our team being able to win a medal." Like, whatever's going on, set that aside. I'll take her at her word that she knew that she didn't have it, right? That whatever they call it, the twisties. You learn these things when something happens, right? Where she couldn't orient herself in the air. Well, one, she could snap her neck, so because the stuff they do is incredible. Two, yeah, she did undermine or weaken their chance at gold. And they didn't get gold, but her, at least one of her stated reasons was, if I go out and do this again, we might not even be on the podium at all. So to me, there's a humility in that. Number one, because it's sacrificing somewhat of your own image for the team. Number two, she had to know, or at least probably figure it out. I mean, I would guess she had to know how much criticism she'd come under for that, right? That people would be all over her like there are. So yeah, I think that's a case.
Yeah, and I guess this takes us back to originally when we spoke about like thinking about yourself rightly, right? If we saw this in the European situation with the soccer competition, and some players didn't take the penalty, and I was for England, and I was like, why are you guys not taking the? Why is this 18-year-old guy volunteering to take this penalty, and everyone's standing there saying, "Yeah, we're fine with it"? I mean, and it could be that some of the guys on the field were like, "Hey, I'm too tired. I don't think I can do this." So it was just kind of out of necessity. It's always easier when we look at these situations, and it is a humble thing to say, "Yeah, I'm one of the best players in the world, but right now, I don't think I'm going to make this. So I'm going to leave it to someone else who I think has a better chance."
Yeah.
And it could be the case that she made the humble decision in saying, "Guys, I'm sorry, I don't think this is going to work, and it's also dangerous. So I don't want to maybe jeopardize the rest of my career. I want to be back for the next Olympics and actually win gold or something like that."
And we just don't know what's going on in people's mind. That's what take the penalty kick thing. People jumped all over Grealish right away, and then he's like, "Look, I wanted to take it, but that was the coach's decision, and this is how they practiced it." And so sometimes, and with Simone too, it's like the culture we're in, it would just jump all over everybody. All these assumptions, we know what's going on, we know your motivations, and that's a lack of humility too, because we don't have a clue. I mean, I teach Christian Miller's book, The Character Gap. I use that in my beginning intro to ethics class, and there's a discussion in there about motives, right? And it's hard to know if somebody else is virtuous because we don't always know their motives. Well, I don't know what's going on in Simone Biles' soul and in her mind any more than I knew what was going on in Grealish. Although, as an Arsenal supporter, I was devastated. I wanted England to win, but also was like, "God, Jesus, this better not destroy him," because Saka is like one of the brightest players on our team from our academy. But he'll come back. But anyway, I think that's another good example. It can be humility. It could also be pride, right? I think I don't want to be the one to miss the goal. I don't want that to happen to me. We don't know. Right?
Yeah.
And so instead of just judging it, we just have to be more comfortable with stuff that we don't know, whether it's doctrines that aren't as clearly taught, but there are plausible interpretations in Scripture, or what's going on in a gymnast or a soccer player's head.
Yeah. Okay. We'll finish off with this. In the world of social media, because I know you're active on social media, and I appreciate that. And I don't. There's stuff you put, man, where my initial reaction is I've written stuff and I've deleted on your posts. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, that's good. I've done the same thing to myself and others.
And so, but some of them are very challenging to me, and so that's why I want to thank you for actually being active. I know it's weighty because sometimes I'll see a comment and there's like 70 something comments on the bottom, and it's like, oh man, I'm not even gonna get involved in this because it's already on fire.
Right.
And a while ago, you posted something I commented on, and then you ended up deleting it, and then sent me a message saying, "Hey, I deleted that message because, and you gave your reasons." And again, that for me is like, hey, there's humility here. It's not like I said it, so what? So in a world where Twitter, Facebook messages, whatever, YouTube, you record something and put it up there. How do we navigate this stuff? How do we I know you won't have like the complete answer, but you know, because
Yeah.
we want to honor Jesus, even if someone's not a Christian, we still believe someone could be like a well-rounded individual in these areas and function well. So what are some tips that you might have?
Yeah, I think so. This is something I've gone back and forth on over the past 13 or 14
Mm.
years. I gave a talk here on our campus in a lecture series, I think it was 2008 or 10, called The Ethics of Facebook. So it's a long time ago, but still Facebook was, big deal even
Mm.
then. And I basically like went through some philosophy and psychological work that had been done. It's like you should probably not be on it at all. And if you are on it, really limit it. And I had been off it for a few years, and then when you're like do what we do, and a lot of people in church and minister academia, well, I just need to get on there so I can like have, whether it's have a platform or have a good influence, or some people just get on there to sell books. Although
Mm-hmm.
from what I can tell, not my books, of course not, because philosophy, but even others who write books are like bestsellers that don't even have social media.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say you can have a good influence there, right? But maybe some of the same. It's trying to realize, man, the medium is tough. So it's realizing that's a person, even if it's someone I've never met before. It's another human being in God's image, whether it's someone who's all over me because of my politics, or someone who maybe I've had atheists come at me over stuff I've written online, and just kind of, for me, it's actually easier to deal with an atheist charitably than another Christian. Maybe because I'm in in a public university, and so that's. But anyway, I think sometimes it's just like you don't have to. Like I've tried to minimize, just because I have a thought or a response to something doesn't mean I have to actually type it in, right, to
Mm.
Twitter or Facebook. I can read something, and if I like it, that's great. I'll press the little like. If I don't like it or really disagree, I'm trying to take that extra step. Like, okay, I disagree with this. Why? Or this makes me mad. Why? That sort of intermediate, or that step between reading and writing, right?
Mm.
Because it's that initial reaction sometimes comes out of anger or a passion for justice or for what's true or whatever, but just a delay, right? Well, and just doing it less. So I've just tried to push back less um,
Mm.
on stuff I disagree with, whether with Christians or not. That's one thing. I think actually in recent weeks, I've been on it less time per day or per week. I'm gone days without, even a week without posting, which for me, because I tend to be kind of active on there, that was relatively unique. I read a book a couple weeks ago, called maybe a month ago, called Digital Minimalism. It's a guy that, not a Christian, I don't think, but just he's never had social media. Um, and so he talks about that. But something that stuck with me, because I think that there are redeemable aspects. There are good things about it. But the best advice from that book was, people talk about the positives of social media, and there definitely are positives, and I can give you a litany of them from my experience. But you can get those positives in much less time, which then enables you to avoid a lot of the negatives,
Mm.
right? Because everything's set up to keep you there, right? I mean, we know this. They've got experts in psychology, and they pick the color of blue that they think will get people to enter. I mean, just really subtle, minute detail.
Mm-hmm.
And so just realizing that it's the whole thing's built to get you there to see the next ad, right? To spend an hour instead of 10 minutes. So I would say that, just intentionally limiting time. And so even, I decided I'm just going to take a week and not say anything on social media, and then that was good, because then I'm like, I don't really miss this, right? And so then I dip back in and say a few things, and then go away, right? And that's what I think is good. How can I get the good and avoid the bad, and then let your values, your beliefs guide the time and way you interact, rather than just, if you just get into it passively, then values and the structures themselves will guide you. And
Mm.
we don't want that. We don't want that at all. That's for sure. So I don't know. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
No,
But
I think it does. My wife, my wife's Facebook and Instagram account got hacked, and some weird stuff was being posted. It got hacked to the point where Facebook is not recovering the account. I think they've completely deleted the account, which is kind of sad because she had pictures on there and stuff that's
yeah,
wrong. But I was talking to her the other day, and I made some kind of comment. She's like, "Yeah, I'm not on social media. I don't miss it. I don't want to be on there." Like,
yeah,
okay, That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, again, it goes back to how can we honor God in everything that we're doing. And if I'm gonna read something and have an immediate reaction to it, and it's gonna be nasty, probably makes sense for me to go take a walk, and then come back and see if I still want to do that.
Yeah.
Talk to Jesus first. Well, Mike, thank you for agreeing to jump on here and talk about this. We're gonna try to put as many of the links as possible to the stuff that you've worked on, and for people who are interested in that, then you guys can go and buy it. I'm sure Mike will be very happy with that. He does have a book on developing virtue. It's called Being Good, uh, right? That you
That's right.
co-authored. That you
Yeah.
co-authored that too.
Yeah, with Doug Guyvett. It's actually a co-edited book. So we've got theologians and philosophers. They each take a particular virtue, Christian virtue, explain what it is, why it's valuable, and then at the end of each chapter, there's like some suggested ways to intentionally cultivate it. Some of the chapters are a little more difficult than others, but if you stick with it, I think if you're interested in that kind of thing, it'll definitely be beneficial.
Yeah, so because we were talking about practical stuff, and that book has a number of those things. So
Yeah.
make sure you guys check that out. Well, we've hit our hour. Thank you for watching. If you've made it here, either live or on the replay people, you're amazing, because you guys actually sit there and watch the replays of this stuff. If you're not subscribed, make sure that you subscribe. You like it. Again, that's because YouTube algorithms make you more visible when you do that stuff. But with that said, God bless you guys, and I will see you guys next time.
All right. Thanks.